Welcome to Preserving Valor, a podcast dedicated to saving the personal stories of veterans. My name is Jay Vissers. This is the fifth and final episode in the story of U.S. Army veteran Brian Vissers. After his convalescent leave, Brian was ordered to Germany. When he left the hospital in California, he had ordered the corpsman there to clip his grown-in stitches off at the skin and leave the remainder there.
Fast forward now to England, or to Germany, and that thing started festering, and it was causing quite a sore. So I went down to the infirmary, and I knew we had a PA there, that it was a warrant officer. We knew each other quite well, and I went in and I says, I've got a stitch that was left in my leg. I said, I got to have it cut out. And he says, okay. He says, hop up here. And he says, you want anything for the pain? I said, no, it's scar tissue. I'm not worried about that. So lay down. I said, I want to watch you. And he kind of looked at me, and he started cutting, and the room started spinning, and I laid down. He commenced to laugh. He chuckled throughout the entire thing. Big, tough infantryman. And I worked at the 7th Corps headquarters there.
The 7th Corps was headquartered in Stuttgart and tasked with guarding part of the border between East and West Germany.
I was the junior man on the entire headquarters, junior officer in the entire headquarters. We worked in an office that, at the time, if people knew about it, they would have jailed every one of us. Our mission statement was to monitor and report racial unrest and dissidents in the 7th Corps area of operations. And if there was any racial incident, race incident that happened anywhere in the Corps, they got reported to us. And it was classified based on its severity and how many people were involved. And then any act of dissidence, which was important at the time because there was a group operating in Germany, in the civilian world in Germany, called the Baader-Meinhof gang. And these were people that were bent on disrupting NATO and the German government.
The Baader-Meinhof gang referred to themselves as the Red Army faction. They self-described as communist and anti-imperialist urban guerrilla group.
They were local terrorists is what it amounted to. They bombed several of our caserns, several of our clubs, 1 EM, 2 EM clubs. The leadership of the gang, believe it or not, was fouled. We had the headquarters compound was its own compound, and then adjacent to it, on kind of a sub-compound, was the housing unit. The housing unit was not gated, was not fenced. The headquarters was. And then there was an open field, and on the other side of that field was this apartment complex, and it was a high-rise apartment complex. And one day, I got up early, come to work, and because I think I mentioned to you earlier that I had a top secret crypto clearance. I was the only one in the well, I take that back. There were 3 others in the headquarters that had that kind of a security clearance, and they were all down in the basement in the secure message center. So because of my clearance, I could go there, and my job was every morning, I went down there and picked up the packet, the secret packet for the G2. That's who I worked for. And then I'd bring it on upstairs and I'd make the delivery. That was just my routine. So I got up early to go to work. I was one of the first ones in. And I got up this morning and I couldn't get in. There was an MP detail at the gate. There was barbed wire across the gate. I couldn't walk straight in. I had to walk a dodged path in so no one could run straight in or drive a vehicle straight in. I had to show my ID, and I'm thinking, what is going on? Of course, at the time, we were all worried about the Fulda Gap. That's where the Russians were going to invade.
The Fulda Gap was a lowland corridor considered one of the likely routes for a tank column to advance in the event of a surprise attack by the Soviet Union.
So we were thinking that maybe something happened with the Russians. It wasn't that. It was this Baader-Meinhof gang who had been bombing some of our casernes. A caserne is the German word for small garrison. And come to find out, that high-rise apartment that sat across the field from our housing had the Baader-Meinhof gang in it. I'm not sure how we got there, but that's... we were talking about the job that I did there. Once a week, I would go in and bring General Mearns, who was the Corps commander. He was a 3-star general. So you've got the junior-most officer briefing the senior-most officer. And if you don't think I didn't have difficulty holding my bladder when I walked in the office, that was... but through those briefings, he got to know me. Now again, junior officer, remember this. I got summoned to his office one day, and of course I walked in and reported, and he said, Vissers, he said, I'm going to start a PT program for my staff officers. He had 3 generals working for him and a boatload of full colonels. He says, I want to start a PT program for my primary staff, and you're going to lead it. And I said, okay, sir. And I'm thinking, what are you doing to me? So we got out that first morning. We're out there on the PT field. Everybody's in formation. Generals are in the front row, and the colonels, so on. And I didn't know how to deal with this other than to mimic what I had learned and what had been done to me in PT. And so it was, all right, we're going to do the daily dozen, and I will count you will count the cadence, and I'll count the repetitions. And we're going to go through it. So jumping jacks. And I went through this whole thing, and somebody grumbled in the back. And the general stopped me. He turned around, he says, apparently I haven't made it clear to you, but this is our PT. We're going to go through it. That young lieutenant is my representative. So when he tells you to do something, it's like me telling you to do something, and you will comply. Is that clear? I'll never forget that, because the feeling in the pit of my stomach at that point in time was, I'm going to die. Somebody is going to take retribution. I don't know, what did you do to me? So we did PT, and here's this little lieutenant running all these field officers in formation around the caserne. People got a big kick out of it. We tried to get out on the economy as much as we could. Esther's parents both spoke German, and what they would do at home is, if they didn't want the kids to understand what they were talking about, they spoke German. Well, it didn't take Esther and her siblings long to start picking up on German. So she could understand much of what was said in the economy, but she didn't speak. Well, then we had a university substation, if you will, there in Stuttgart. The University of Maryland Stuttgart Division is what it was called. And I started, because I didn't have my college degree yet, I started taking college classes. And one of them was German, so I could get along on the economy. Each community would have bazaars periodically, and of course the big one to go to was the Christmas bazaar. When we first got there, Esther and I lived on the economy in a little town called Möhringen. We got used to it after a while. where every other day we would go to market to buy the milk and the bread and the stuff like that we ate. And that was fun. Mom and Dad came to visit. And so we're out looking at the economy, and we stopped for lunch one day, and it was the guest house was on a farm. And when we pulled in, we could see that it was butchering day. And we thought that was cool. So we go into the guest house. It's a little guest house, not much. The dining room wasn't much bigger than here in the living room put together. We go in to eat some good German food. And Dad was smart enough. He said, Jaeger Schnitzel. And I said, it's most of the house plots, but I ordered the house plate. I wasn't astute enough to understand that was butchering day. And on butchering day, the plate of the day is a blood sausage. And so they brought my plate out, and here's this nice big sausage on there. It looked delicious. And I cut into it, and it goes, bloop, and all that cooked coagulated blood came out. And everybody in the guest house knew what was going to happen. And the whole place erupted in laughter. The kitchen people had come out to watch. And I looked at that, and the waitress came over and she said, would you like a Jaeger Schnitzel instead of that? And I said, yes, please. 3 times a week, the G2 staff would go out to a guest house for lunch. And this is just one guest house in the economy. They had rolling terrain there, and you'd be driving along and you'd come over top of a little hill, and there'd be a small ville, a dozen houses and a guest house and maybe some other service center. And we would go to those things. We'd go to different ones, partly to support the economy, partly to have a good time, partly to foster good relations with the people of Germany. Not once did I meet a person, and we'd see a lot of older people, and most of us knew enough German to have a conversation with the public. And not once did we meet a German who fought on the Western Front. They all fought the Soviets. It was interesting, we knew that wasn't necessarily true, and it didn't bother us if we didn't come across somebody who would admit fighting on the Western Front. But it was interesting that they were still that, I don't know if I want to use the term sensitive or the term embarrassed about the war, that they did not want to admit that they were our enemy at one time, even though we had rebuilt the economy. Stuttgart was an interesting town. You drive in from the state headquarters in Meringen on B-27, that was the name of the highway. And you kind of went up, and then you dropped down into the city. And when you made that drop down into the city, if you looked off on your left, you'd see this huge hill with a white cross on the top of it. And my first couple times in the city, I thought that was really odd. Finally, I asked someone, and fortunately, my question was to an American, a fellow GI, and they says, that's kind of a bone of contention right there. That's our embarrassment. Stuttgart was bombed heavily. If the bombing mission was to the north, to the industrial complex, the run would come in and the aircraft would turn south. And as they came out over Stuttgart, they dumped the balance of their ordnance. The ones that flew in to the south for more of the mining and agricultural area, they would turn to the north and dump their ordnance, their leftover ordnance, on Stuttgart. So in essence, every time there was a bombing run, they would turn and come out over Stuttgart and dump the balance of their ordnance. That town was level. There was nothing at the end of World War II in Stuttgart. So when they started rebuilding, all they could do was bulldoze up all the rubble, and they took it out and they put it on this huge hill. And the estimate was that there were 20,000 people buried in that mound. And that's why the cross was on top of it.
An estimated 1.5 million cubic meters of rubble were moved to the hill called the Birkenkop. The original wooden cross was replaced with a steel cross in 2003.
Then I finished up my tour there as the Assistant S1 for the Special Troops Battalion. Special Troops Battalion was the support battalion for the headquarters. And that was kind of a heartbreak, too. I wanted to stay in Germany, and I had just gotten orders for the 3rd Infantry Division, and I had gone up to the division and interviewed with the battalion commander that I would be working for, and he made me the platoon leader for his scout platoon. This is a mech infantry outfit, and the scout platoon is a separate asset for the battalion, and it's a 5th company, if you will. It's a big platoon. It's a platoon plus. So I was going to be the platoon leader, and then he told me, he said, that time counts as command time, and then the Alpha Company commander is going to be leaving, and you will be moved into that position, which was a captain's position, and that was all command time. My plan was to come back to the United States and go through infantry advanced school, and I would have an assignment in CONUS in continental U.S. after that, because I'd have all my command time in, and that would just launch my career. There was a day when the battalion commander called me in his office, and he was visibly upset, and he said, Brian, I don't know how else to tell you this, but just to give you this, and he handed me an envelope, and inside the envelope was a set of orders separating me from the Army. And I looked at it, and I didn't know how to react to it. My career 2 hours ago was all set. And now I've got this piece of paper in my hand that said, you're no longer needed, go home. It ruined my whole life. I didn't know how to react to it. How do I go home and tell my wife? What do I do? I don't have any other career plans. How do I change? Finally, after driving around for a while, around the German countryside for a while, I worked up the courage to go home and tell Esther what had happened. Because Esther was pregnant with Sherry, the Army kept us on board until after Sherry was born. So I left Germany and went to Fort Ben Harrison in Indianapolis. From there, we came up here to Michigan, came back to Michigan. This is the bittersweet part of it. I get to Fort Ben Harrison, and I'm going to be the post-alcohol and drug control officer. So I'm working on the special staff of the post commandant, the one-star general. So I report to him. Brian, he says, why don't you sit down? I said, yes, sir. I'm sitting at attention, and he said, relax, please. He said, I've got something to tell you. And I said, all right. And he says, does my name sound familiar to you at all? And I said, not really, sir. He says, I signed your orders separating you from the Army. And he served on the commission that oversaw that. It's called a reduction in force, a RIF. He said, I sat on the committee that oversaw the RIF. There were 3 of them. I got caught in the last one. He said, I will tell you something. He said, after I knew you were coming here, I reviewed your record. He said, your record is impeccable. He said, but I remember reviewing your case. He said, the reason that you are being separated is because you don't have a college degree. He said, everything else that you did was wonderful. And I said, sir, I was enrolled in University of Maryland. He said, I know. He said, but you didn't finish in time. So that was really hard to deal with. Adding that on top of some of the junk that I came out of Vietnam with was hard.
After attempting a couple other careers, Brian finally went to work at the local sheriff's office and joined the National Guard.
When I was headquarters battery commander, the National Guard at about that time had a pretty lousy reputation. They were party boys. A lot of beer and alcohol in the field. Many of the soldiers treated their annual training as vacation to get away from the family and so on. And there were a number of us in the 119th that were combat veterans, right sleevers. If you remember, the combat patch went on your right sleeve. And we just felt that was unacceptable. So we set about changing that. And we did, to a very large part. Just before I left, just before I retired, I was the brigade fire support officer. I was major. I had worked with the aviation battalion at an annual training, 238th Aviation over here in Grand Ledge. I came back to 119th because I wanted to see Richard. He was in the Guard then by then. At least have a meal with him and spend the night and then go on to my next assignment. And I pulled in and I parked my Jeep at the car park, which I was a little disappointed with because I didn't see anything else there. And then after I got my Jeep parked and threw a camouflage poncho over the windshield, I realized, in those bushes is a car. Oh, over there's Deuce and a Half. Oh, there's... And I thought, this is set up just exactly how it's supposed to be, how I taught them to do it. So I'm walking up. We had a joke in the Army. If you wanted to get to a headquarters, you turn the engine of your Jeep off and you listened for the generator, and that generator then is where the headquarters was. You'd head over that way. I listened, yep, sure enough, the generator's up here. I started walking and I'm looking because there's supposed to be a checkpoint, a control point to control whoever comes toward that door. I'm looking, I see nothing. And my spirits absolutely fell. I taught these guys better than this. I taught them how to put together a checkpoint, dig the foxhole, dig it properly. I'm really down. My tail is dragging as I'm walking up the trail. And all of a sudden, I heard the bolt of an M60 machine gun come home. Crack. And I stopped and I started looking around. And over here on this side, I hear some giggling. And one of the guys, he's got you, sir. And man, my heart leapt out of my chest. It was the greatest thing I had ever heard in my life. They listened. Not only did they listen, but they continued it after I left. And I was so happy, so pleased. And after we left, not all of us were gone. That's when the mobilization started. That's when Guard units were being mobilized and sent overseas. And so we performed a very real needed training, and I still maintain contact with my old first sergeant. We often talk about that. We often reflect on that. How the most important part of our service wasn't in Vietnam. The most important part of our service was training these guys that didn't necessarily have the combat skills to have combat survivability and prepare them.
Brian's experience in the military, particularly seeing combat, ended up reinforcing the lessons he learned from his father about caring for others.
Those that have combat experience are the biggest pacifists in the world. We don't want this to happen to other people. We don't want to see other people go through what happens when there's a war. That's why my heart, on the front of the house, you see the Ukrainian flag. One of the reasons that's there was because my heart breaks over what's happening in Ukraine.
I'd like to thank Brian for the chance to listen to and share the story of his military service. His retelling gives us a ground-level view of a conflict that continues to be studied and debated to this day, and a reminder of the price of freedom. An unedited version of our interview has been submitted to the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. To ensure you don't miss any future episodes of Preserving Valor, remember to follow us on Spotify, Substack, or YouTube. We look forward to bringing you more histories from real veterans in our next season. And once more, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Brian and the veterans who served alongside of him. Their courage, sacrifice, and dedication are a testament to the spirit of service.